My name is Clancy. I'm an alcoholic. I'm glad to be here. I very much enjoyed Bob's talk. I always like to hear Bob talk. He's one of the few Al-Anons that hold my attention. And the rest of you are the others, of course. But Bob made some remark about there being thousands of people out here. Obviously there are not, but you just change one word. There are thousands of personalities. And that's just in this row. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of AA, because just some of the things you might not know, because without AA there would be no Al-Anon, without Al-Anon we wouldn't be here. And without AA it just seems incredible there would not be an AA. But you know, as I mentioned last night, there seem to be two types of alcoholics. One who are able to quit and clean up their act and not drink anymore, and others who quit and clean up their act and eventually drink again and clean up their act and drink again until they die or something happens. And that's the type of alcoholic that gathers, of course, in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's the type of alcoholic that's been a problem to mankind for 4,000 years of written history. People just can't imagine why these people act this way. There's no helping them. And it went on and on. At one time I guess they thought they were possessed by devils and put them to death and beat them and flogged them and sent them away. And England would send them to Australia, colonies, just get them out of here. There's no help for them. And which was kind of amazing that there's been medicine and religion and social services, all sorts of people have tried to help these people to no avail. And there have been occasional, looks like it's going to be fine, and it isn't. And it's surprising when you think at the end of 4,000 years, when I was born and grew up, when I was a boy in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, there was still no answer to it after all these years. And a series of funny little things happened, funny little coincidences, as old Norm Alp used to say, seconds and inches. But if any one of them hadn't happened just the way they did, we wouldn't be here. It's just almost frightening. Now I just talk about those little things. In 1930, a wealthy family in New York had a son who was in his 30s, and he was a very bright young man. He worked in the company and so on, but he seemed to be afflicted by nervous conditions, just bad nerves, and he'd get his nerves would go to hell, and he'd drink, and if they only could straighten out these nerves. So it was the middle of the Depression. Nobody had any money, but they had money. They had a big company. And so they contacted the best doctor in the world to see if he'd work with their son. Here's something you might not know. Their first contact was to Dr. Freud. And Dr. Freud chose not to take the case, which is the first break we ever had. We'd be sitting here today drunk and crazy and saying, but I dreamt I was okay. So they went to his ex-student and colleague, Dr. Jung, and he agreed to take them, and said two people took this man to the doctor's hospital in Switzerland, where apparently he worked with them every day for a year to help him break through the conflicts that are binding him. At the end of a year, he said, well, Roland, you seem to understand the nature of your problem. I think you go home. I think you'll be all right now. So he came home, and he stopped in Paris, and some friends of his family, wealthy people, had him for dinner, and they toasted his success. And he had a glass of wine, and everybody was shocked, because a couple of days later, he was face down drunk again, just absolutely hopeless. And they got another blank check and sent him back to Switzerland, and the doctor refused to take him back. And they said, why? Roland didn't mean any harm. He hasn't been a bad man. He said, no. He said, in effect, I have no feeling about that at all. He said, I just realized now that I've misdiagnosed his case. I thought he had deep psychological problems I could help him with, but I see now that he is what is known as an alcoholic, a chronic alcoholic. And to the best of my knowledge, there is no effective treatment for that in the world today at any price. That was 1931, not very long ago. And of course, Roland said, what does this mean, doctor? And the doctor says, well, it means, Roland, that you will in effect have to keep yourself confined voluntarily or involuntarily as long as you live. Otherwise, you almost certainly will intermittently drink to excess until you die or go mad. Not good news, huh? And Roland, of course, said, is there any way to go? And the doctor apparently talked to us a little bit about, he said, in the literature I've seen some cases of some involuntary psychological reversion. They refer to it as a spiritual experience, but I've never seen one. And I think your chance of receiving one might be less than being hit by lightning. And so Roland came home, and he didn't stop for his celebratory dinner in Paris, and he got in the ship, and on the way home I guess he did something that all of us have to do, but he didn't realize it and we don't realize it. On that ship he somehow surrendered to the fact that he was hopeless and helpless. There was nothing he could do. And he came home and he racked his brain, what can I do to... And at that time there was a movement afoot called the Oxford Movement, which again by a series of coincidences was in full flower. It was started in 1912 in Pennsylvania by some Lutheran minister. He wanted to get back to the elements that made such early Christians so willing to die for their faith, and he called himself the First Century Christian Association. And he didn't get very much taken for it. Who wants to, I don't want to learn how to be crucified upside down, But he went to England, and for some reason, there's some students, the people at Oxford University really took it on. Oh, we love this. This is great. And it gradually evolved into something called the Oxford Movement. And they brought it back to the United States, and it got to be kind of a spiritual, well, if you remember EST, where people get together and discuss psychological things, like that for spirituality. Nice people would get together in homes and discuss spiritual breakthroughs and help. And he thought, maybe I should go to that, because he already was an elder in the Presbyterian Church, a vestryman, I guess they called him. And so he went to the Oxford group. As he wrote later, I wanted to stay sober as long as I could, so that when I died drunk, my parents would have a pleasant memory of me. And sure enough, some years later, when he died apparently drunk, his parents had a friendly memory of him. But anyway, he went to this Oxford movement, and he did well. He flourished. He stayed sober. His parents were just great. And after a while, they said, gee, Roland, you're doing such a good job. Why don't you go take a nice vacation, go up to Vermont to our summer home where we've always gone in the summertime, and go up there and enjoy yourself, and relax. All right, that's very nice. So he went up there. And the odd thing is this, if he'd gone 2 weeks later, we wouldn't be here. Can you imagine that? Because he got there, and as soon as he got there, he got settled down, and one of his friends came over and said, oh, Roland, I'm glad you're here. We have this friend of ours, we used to all run around together when we were kids, named Ebby, and he's a bad drunk, and maybe you could help him. Tell him about the Oxford group or something. So he said, sure, I'll try to help him. And he tried to talk to him. I don't want to hear that crap. I don't want to hear that religious crap, Roland. Okay. Well, the next week, Ebby, while drunk, drove his car into a house and was in bad shape, and he was on probation already, and was going to go to court now to be sentenced to the penitentiary. And his friend came back and said, Roland, you got to help us. My dad is the judge, and I can't convince him of anything, but you can, because he knows you and your family. Would you, since you're here, would you come down and appear in court for Ebby? Maybe that'll help. He said, okay. So we went down to court and said, I'd be glad to take him back to New York and get him out of here if you'd trust me, Judge. The judge said, I know you, and I know your father, and I know your family. I don't know that I could do this for anyone else, but I'll release him in your custody, but he must be taken out of Vermont. If he comes back here, he'll go to the penitentiary. So Roland brought him back to New York and stuck him in a mission on Lower Broadway and got him going active in the Oxford group. And Roland wasn't Ebby wasn't crazy about this, but it's better than the Vermont State Penitentiary, Not much, but... And one of the things they had to do in the Oxford movement was once you did it for a while, they wanted you to testify, to share what you have found with someone else, to show the wonderful growth you've made. And one day Roland said, well, Ebby, it's time to testify. He said, I don't want to testify. And that's embarrassing. You want to go back to Vermont to penitentiary? No, I believe I'll testify. But who is he going to testify to? And he happened to think he had another friend of his from Vermont who was living in New York, a mooch living off his wife, a nothing, couldn't hold a job, a boob. I suppose he thought, I'll go testify to him. He won't remember it the next day. He's a goof. So he looked up this idiot, the phone book named Bill Wilson, and made arrangements to go call on him to testify. Of course, in our book, Bill Wilson talks about his version of it. And Debbie came to the door and he looked very sharp, and I said, how is it? And he said, I've got religion and depression. So I heard Debbie talk many years ago, and he had a slightly different version of that. It was true up to that point, but then he said he sat at the kitchen table and talked to Bill at length, and Bill just kept drinking as fast as he could. That's really great, Debbie. And this offended him. So our literature does not mention this, but I guarantee it's true. He came back 3 days later, and he had the Oxford group closer with him. I want to talk to you about the Oxford group, about spiritual. And Bill Wilson, I'm happy to say, reacted to this by going off on one of the worst drunks of his life. And he started off to see Ebby at the mission and got drunk on the way, and by the time he got there he was drunk, and Ebby was there, but he gave a small sermon anyway, and on down the street and drunk and crazy, and wound up back at the hospital again where he'd been before. And the head of the hospital called up his wife and said, Mrs. Wilson, I'm very sorry, but I don't think Bill has any of these left in him. I don't think he's going to survive. He may survive this one, but he won't survive anymore, I don't think. And she was panic-stricken. So she called up the mission, got a hold of Ebby, said, will you please go, would you go down and talk to Bill? And he said, took a couple of Oxford groups. Up to see Bill and said, Bill, you got to find a power greater than yourself. You can't just do it on your own. Oh, I don't want to hear that religious crap. Get out of here. Okay, I went home. And then in the middle of the night, this drunken ne'er-do-well, least deserving probably of anybody that you knew, was one of those who had an involuntary spiritual experience. He didn't know it was a spiritual experience. He thought he was going crazy. As he wrote, the room was full of light, and I thought I heard wind blowing, and God, I thought I'm going crazy. And he didn't know what to make of it. And he told the doctor later. The doctor said, I don't know what it was, Bill, but whatever you got, hang on to it. You look different. Bill came out of that hospital and went to the Oxford group. And you think, what's the big deal? Why do we need LB and all this story about that? Because of the very few people who ever had spiritual experiences, they associated them with church and would go to church work. But he associated with somehow stopping drinking with Ebby, so we went to the Oxford group. And he spent the next few months trying to help drunks. He thought he had a calling now to help drunkards. And he would take street people off the street, old bums, and bring them to the Oxford group meetings, which made the people there happy as, I believe you're vomiting on my shoes, sir. And he would take them home if they had no place to stay, and he'd really try to help them. And he just went on and on. He tried to help people. He just driven Ebby tagging along behind him. And one morning he got up after about 6 months, and he watched his wife, this chic, lovely society girl he'd married, and now had developed into a rather dowdy old failure, wife of a failure, with salt and pepper hair, and putting on her sweater with a patch on the sleeve to go work in a cheap department store to make enough money to keep him going. And he realized what a charade this has been. This is meaningless. This is meaningless. And he looked at his wife and said, Lois, I'm so sorry I put you through this. You've supported me. And this morning, the guy that I brought home last night has stolen the coffee pot out of the kitchen. And I'm not going to do this anymore. I've tried to help people, and I'm not going to. I've wasted my time for 6 months. I've helped people every day, and not one person has stayed sober. And Bob mentioned that this morning. And she turned to him and said something that changed the course of human history, and most importantly, our lives. And what she said, of course, was that I was having lunch with her in Mamaroneck, New York, I guess 1971. I said, how did you ever think of that answer? God, you just changed the course of history. She said, I don't know, it just seems so obvious. He said, not one person has stayed sober. And she said, you did. And he said, oh yeah. That's why old timers don't have much hair in front. You just go through it. It's always something, for Christ's sake. So he continued to do it and continued to try. And eventually, most of us know the story. He got somebody who decided to take one. They'd seen him stay sober now for a year. They're going to give him one more chance. He had been working in the stock market when he was in his good years. Now he's in his bad years. And they said, go to Akron, Ohio. I want you to take care. We're going to take over this business out there. We're going to make you president. but you got to buy the proxies. You got to get everything going. So good. He went out to Akron, Ohio, kind of afraid, but and the whole thing blew up. Just blew up. And here he was, failed again. And he stood in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, an old hotel in downtown Akron. And he reached in his pocket. He had a $10 bill. He didn't know whether to pay his hotel bill or buy a train ticket home. He couldn't do both. And he looked over it. There was a little door with a curved sign over it. It says cocktails in neon sign. And he had the feeling, if I just had a couple of drinks, I bet I could think of something. And he started to walk. And your life and mine hung by the thinnest thread available. And out of the corner of his eye, I saw some telephones. And over the telephones were a bunch of, as they do in small town hotels, the leading churches, their ministers. And he remembered he promised to call some Oxford group member if he got in trouble in Akron. So he walked over there and took a nickel and called the first number. He said, I'm a rum hound from New York. I'm trying to find someone I can talk to. The man said, I don't know what your problem is, sir, but I'm trying to write a sermon. Please don't bother me. And hung up. Not funny at all. And the next one didn't answer. And the next one didn't go through. And I'll tell you, I don't know about you, but I'm afraid I would have said, well, I did what I said I would do. Jesus, I'll just get a drink or two. It'll be. But instead he saw the name Walter Tunk, liked that name, and he called Walter Tunk, and Dr. Walter Tunk said, I'm so glad to hear from you. I have a parishioner I just talked to this morning. Her doctor is a bad drinker, and perhaps I can get in touch with her. You stay there and give me your phone number. And so Bill sat in his phone number in his phone booth, hot phone booth in downtown Akron, and he called her and gave her the guy's number. And the woman called Bill and said, yes, I have a man just like that. And, he's a nice man, but he just admitted to us that he has a terrible drinking problem. And perhaps I can get you two together and maybe you can help him. She said, I'll see if I can reach him. Stay there and wait. So she called Mrs. Smith. Now, it's such a small thing, but if that phone hadn't been answered, we wouldn't be here. She happened to be there. The doctor happened to be laying drunk on the floor, just by luck. And she called, just by luck, I'll tell you, because if she'd have been outside with him, we would not be here. And she said, well, I can't get the doctor to meet anybody today. He's rather drunk, but we can do it tomorrow. So this woman called back to Bill, and I was glad she was there because, Bill wasn't going to wait indefinitely in that phone booth, I'll tell you. I wouldn't. We always think of these people as great, wonderful people who are just humans like us with all the fallibilities, maybe more. And so she told him how to come out to her house on the streetcar the next day, and Dr. Bob came out with his wife and 2 kids. And most of us, if you're now, maybe you've heard Dr. Bob's son, Smitty, talk, and he talks about that trip, how his father was saying to his mother, I don't want to go out there, I don't want to get another lecture on my drinking, I'm sick of it. But this is Mother's Day, so I'll do it for you, Ann, but I'll give this guy 20 minutes and that's it. And they got out there, and he just didn't want to listen to this evangelist talk about his drinking, as none of us do. But they finally went into a room together and spent 3 or 4 hours. And he came out and he looked up and said, my God, I've never met anybody who seems to know how I feel and why I drink. It's amazing. It's just, he said, Bill, could you stay with us a couple of weeks and we could talk some more about this? And Bill thought, well, I've no way to get out of town. Yes, I can stay with you a couple of weeks. And so they moved in. They sat and spent a week discussing spiritual matters and the inner workings of the human spirit and God's love. At the end of the week, Bob was feeling so good. He said, I went to the Medical Association convention last year in Atlantic City and I got drunk. And they all ridiculed me. I want to go this year and show them what's happened to me. He said, you stay here with my wife and kids, I'm going to go. And off he went. And Monday morning, Mrs. Smith got a phone call about 6 in the morning. The doctor's office nurse said, Mrs. Smith, I've got some terrible news. They carried the doctor off the train this morning early, so drunk he couldn't walk. And they laid him on the platform, and the station agent knows me, so he called me. I've come down and got him. I've taken him over here in the cab to his office. He's laying on the floor. I know so much how much you wanted him to stay sober, but So Bill and Dr. and Mrs. Smith came down and got him and brought him home and put him to bed, and just realized the experiment was just about over. And they talked, and a couple of days later, doctor rolled over on my sick and said, "My God, what day is today?" I said, "Well, today's Wednesday, Bob." "Oh, my God. My God, I've got to do a cancer surgery today. And look at my hand. I can't hold a knife. My God, what can I do?" And so they got him up and bathed him, and Bill washed him and took him down and got him a couple drinks so his hand would stop. And they dropped him off to the hospital, went home about 11 o'clock, went home to wait for him. And he's supposed to be home about 2, and he didn't come home at 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, and they realized, drunk again, the old son of a bitch is drunk again. But he came in about 6 o'clock, bright-eyed, sober, clear. He said, "Where have you been, Bob?" He said, "When I was doing that surgery, I was thinking, in the Oxford group, they want you to make amends to people, and I don't think a doctor should have to make amends, but I thought, yes, I do, because I'm a drinker, and I've been all over town making amends, and I just feel wonderful." And they, And that day, that was June 10th, 1935. And that day they decided sitting around discussing spiritual matters is not what had kept Bill sober at all. What had kept him sober was trying to help people. So they found a guy up in the hospital where Dr. Bob had worked. He was there as an alcoholic. He was there for what they used was gastritis for alcoholics those days. And so they went to see him. And they tried to see him. They talked to his wife. He was a lawyer from Louisville who'd moved to Akron to get away from his drinking. And of course his drinking just got worse. But he had a very strong wife. And they talked to his wife and said, "We'd like to talk to Bill if we could." And she went and said, "You know, Bill, there are 2 men who want to talk to you." She said, "I don't want to talk to any more men. I'm sick of servants." But she was a strong woman. So they went in to see him. And I heard him talk years ago. He said, "I was laying in that bed in Akron, Ohio, and these 2 men came to see me. And I wasn't interested in what they said, because I know they talk about my drinking, but they never talked about my drinking once. They talked about their drinking, how they felt. I never heard anybody describe me like that before. I couldn't believe it. I'm so impressed. I've been with them ever since." And he was number 3. Then they had some people around town that tried to preach religion to him. They couldn't stay sober. And finally got a young guy, first young man, who was notable because it wasn't Alcoholics Anonymous yet. It was still the alcoholic wing of the Oxford group. But as our predecessor, he brought something here that he opened Pandora's box. He fell in love with Dr. Bob's daughter and brought us our first relationship. I don't know any word that sends a shudder down a sponsor's spine more than that. "I want to talk to you about my new relationship." Oh, Jesus. You ought to have a machine on your phone that says, What's the book? You know, you hear these boobs say, they didn't say this, but I've heard this. You know, I knew I thought the last girl was the one, but God, this one, when I saw her walking out of detox this morning, terrible. But anyway, he stayed around, and they fell in love, and they got married, which sounds wonderful. That same thing happened to me. My youngest daughter, Susan, married a guy I sponsored, which I just was not in favor of at all, but nobody cared because I'm only a father and a man. I want to give you the absolute epitome of mixed emotions. It's watching your daughter go down the aisle to marry a man whose 5th step you've heard. You can't really say anything, but you can hint. You say, "Let me know if he ever brings a sheep home." And they realized he's a new young bridegroom, so he shouldn't have to be doing all the things they were doing, going to hospitals and going to the Oxford group meetings. You stay home and take care of your wife. So they were surprised when he got drunk and died, and turned her against AA for 50 years. But AA continued. Bill continued. They got a few people. Bill went back to New York, and he got a little thing going there, same kind of thing. And it was struggling. And then, of course, we all know the story about in 1938, they thought, we have to get going. Maybe we should build a chain of hospitals. That'll be it. And we can help alcoholics all over the country. And but how are we going to get the money? Well, we'll write a book, and with the profits from the book, we'll build the hospitals. And so they wrote the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, which many people feel to be divinely inspired. Because I'll tell you something, Bill Wilson didn't know enough to write it. They call it a miracle. Miracle is a word that's used very cheaply in AA. Oh yes, I heard a guy say, I got up early this morning. I saw the sun come up in the eastern sky, and I knew it's a miracle. I have a new day. Get up early tomorrow and have another one, you idiot. Miracles are supposed to be something that are inexplicable, not explainable. What's inexplicable about the book? This guy with no background in psychology or abnormal psychology or medicine, and just watching most of the people he worked with stay drunk long after they started, and all these things, wrote a book that has changed more alcoholic lives in the last 60-some years than all other therapies combined in the history of mankind. That's a miracle. That is a miracle. But nobody wanted to buy the book at first. It's just a drudgery thing. And they thought they have to get some publicity. And they went to see the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers wouldn't give them the money they wanted. It's just, they struggled. They held in there. And in this book, incidentally, they put some stories at the back to kind of fill it out. And we always think about those dedicated, wonderful men. But the nature of alcoholism then was the same as it is now. Most of those people drank again. Now, they didn't drink because they were bad people. But it's always been my feeling that they did not then really fully appreciate that you have to keep doing it after you're sober. It's like, you think like pneumonia, you have to keep taking penicillin for 10 years. But it's like diabetes, you have to keep taking insulin after 10 years. But anyway, they had a little article, somebody wrote an article about them in a little magazine called Liberty in 1940 that made them look as though they were a religious organization. That didn't do any good. And then at the end of 1940, the Saturday Post had a writer who was specialized in unveiling corruption. He just finished a great series on the corrupt Philadelphia labor movement. His new assignment, infiltrate Alcoholics Anonymous and get the word on them. So he did. He traveled to all the groups, St. Louis, Los Angeles, New York, talked to, and he was astonished to find what they said it was. He couldn't believe it. And he wrote this article, published in 1941 in March in the Saturday Post, and it took the nation by storm, because all over the country, people, women and men, had mates who had this terrible drinking and nothing could help them. And they flooded New York with letters. They flooded, in Los Angeles, there was a woman out there named Sybil Corwin who had just been sober a week. They sent them 40 letters of women that had written in. They gave her the letters, go call on these people. She said, call on them, what'll I tell them? Tell them to come with you to the meeting next week. I don't know what the hell to tell them. On and on. And they really grew all over, grew everywhere. It just became wonderful. Large in cities and states everywhere. And by 1942, Alcoholics Anonymous was doing very well. And then Bill Wilson, as he sat in his office, started getting letters. Our group is dying out. Our group is failing. Don't know what it is. There were some fights and arguments. And over the next couple of years, AA didn't do much and began to shrink and shrink. He thought, I'll try to help. I'll start something that'll unify us. I'll start a magazine. I'll call it The Grapevine. It was the size of a regular newspaper then. But that didn't seem to help. And he sat there puzzled. And in 1945, he got an article written by a guy in North Carolina that says, Bill, I bet you're interested in this. And he'd submitted an article for The Grapevine who discussed something that Bill had never heard of. A therapy for alcoholism of our type, even much more effective than AA. It was something called the Washingtonians in the 1840s. Some drunks had got together and founded a group very similar to AA where they talked to each other to help people to get sober. At the end of 5 years, they had It was estimated maybe 100,000 sober drunkards. And that was no phones, no radios, no television, no nothing, just contact and group meetings. And that's how the entertainment of the country was, group meetings usually. And they had a couple of these spellbinders that got them sober. And they went out and talked about this organization, and people would just sign up. And in 1845, they were doing wonderfully well. And then they began to think about something which seems right, because people talk about it day to day. Gosh, if we're able to help alcoholics, shouldn't we help a lot of other people too? Maybe we should help narcotics addicts who don't have an alcohol problem. Maybe we should help people who have emotional problems, and on and on. And so some of them got into anti-slavery movement. Some got into stamping out the temperance, the stamping out of sale of alcohol. Just give it all they got. And the whole movement just went into good works. And by 1848, the Washingtonians were extinct, and nearly all of them had died drunk. I had a book home written many years ago, written in 1861 by one of its few survivors. He talked about, we don't know what happened. We were doing so well, and then the people got too busy for our actions, and we were doing other things, and one by one they just lost track of them. And they became extinct. How extinct? Bill Wilson never heard of them. The only other therapy that had ever worked for alcoholics of our type. So he read this and went to the library and got some literature on it, what he could find, and studied the problems AA was having compared to what they did. That they were fighting over prestige, and they were fighting over which speaker was most famous, and who get the most paper, and who were going to make some money out of this, and who could you convince you were doing wonderfully, and all these fights. And he sat down, and in a last gasp effort to save Alcoholics Anonymous, he wrote the 12 Traditions. You know, we keep thinking they came out at the same time the book did. They didn't. A lot of people went down the toilet waiting for those traditions to come out. And he introduced them in the long form, not the way we see them over there, but if you don't know what, in the back of the book, across in the short form, is the long form, the original version. And he offered them one by one in the grapevine. And Alcoholics Anonymous had a terrible problem then, much the same as it has now. It's full of alcoholics. And so we don't want to hear any rules. We're here for love, goddammit. We don't want to hear those rules, you know. And a lot of people wouldn't accept it. And Bill Wilson would hop on his motorcycle, put Lois the sidecar, and whiz around and talk to people at meetings and about what the traditions are to save us. And in the archives, you see letters sometimes in New York that are so sad. They sound funny, but they're sad. Bill, please come and talk at our anniversary. Unless you're going to talk about the traditions, then don't come. I mean, that's serious. And at this time, of course, Al-Anon had been not thought of yet. Lois was working with the family groups, I guess, or with other women. But among other things, that added to the flux of fights in AA. And so by 1949, end of 1949, they were making some progress, but it wasn't as much as they'd hoped. And Bill and Dr. Bob, they always got along well together. Their followers didn't get along at all. But for example, all over the country was divided. The people in Los Angeles would have nothing to do with Akron. They had only right to New York. People in Chicago had nothing to do with New York, only right to Akron. People all over the country fighting, arguing and fighting. A guy in Florida, they found charging for AA memberships. And I said, why would you do that? He said, well, in Florida, unless they pay for it, they won't pay any attention to it. I sent the money to New York. God, just all kinds of, ugh. And they thought, we got to somehow get these diverse people together and let them see that we're all on the same path. He told their followers, get us a place to have a meeting. The people in Akron said, well, we'll go to a meeting, we won't go to New York. And the people in New York, not to be outdone in spirituality, we'll go to a meeting, we won't go to Akron. So Bill and Dr. got together, came up with a Solomon-like decision. Cleveland. Okay, we'll all go to Cleveland. I have the tapes of that convention. Very poor quality now because they're great to listen to. And it's an interesting thing, at that time was still not very certain, and most of the speakers at that convention were non-alcoholics. the warden of San Quentin, of people in the government zone, to try to convince people we're doing fine. But among other things, Dr. Bob and Bill each gave a little talk. And Dr. Bob, of course, was dying of cancer. And they said, "You probably don't want to talk, Bob." He said, "No, I've got to talk. I'm 15 years sober. I've got the second most sobriety in the world. I feel strongly about this." So his son on one side and a man on the other side led this tall, gaunt, dying man to the podium. And he gave what many people conceive to be the Gettysburg Address of Alcoholics Anonymous. Short, but as appropriate today as in Al-Anon as it is in AA and everywhere for people like us. He started off very mundanely. He said, "Well, I'm so glad to be here. And so I look over this crowd today. I'm so glad that some small thing I did a number of years ago helped bring this about." And he said, "I hope you'll go back to your boys and girls and your groups and tell them if we get out of AA, what we put into it, and it's all the same thing." He said, "I want to apologize for my health. I've been in bed most of the past few months." And just blah, blah, blah. But then he said, "There are 2 or 3 things that I think I'd like to talk, would be of interest." And that's where he kicked in. And because he was so desperately trying to convey what he believed. And he was a great man and a great believer in AA. And it's almost like a deathbed testament, as it were. He said, "First, let us remember to keep our program simple. Let's not louse it all up with Freudian complexes, which may be of interest to the scientific mind, but has nothing to do with our work here. Our work here, when reduced to the last, consists of love and service. And we all know what love is, and we all know what service is." And secondly, he said, "Let us guard that erring member, the tongue, and use it with kindness and love and understanding. And there isn't a person in this room or any room like it in the world that doesn't know exactly what he's talking about. We're all just full of love and kindness when things are going our way. Love is the answer," like that elf said last night again and again. Love is the answer. But let somebody hurt our feelings or threaten us. And I think she twists baby chickens' necks. And finally he said, "None of us would be here today if someone hadn't taken the time to take us to a few meetings, to explain things to us, to give us a pat on the back when we needed it. Let us never reach that stage of smug complacency where we do not have time to help our fellow who is still suffering from this disease." And he said thank you and sat down and was dead shortly thereafter. And very touching. And when you go into the World Service Office in New York and you get off the elevator, that whole speech is right there in front of you on a big wall. It's just a very touching and beautiful thing. And it's as appropriate today as it ever was. And among other things that happened at that convention, of course, the main thing they were trying to do was to get the 12 traditions accepted. And you hear the traditions. They had 6 young guys. I don't know who they were, obviously, but you could just hear their tails wagging. And they told about, each took 2 traditions and explained why they're not rules, they're not laws, they're just suggestions going to save us. You know, we don't have any A police, it's just a matter of love. And I've thought about that too, you know. Over the years I've come to see the reason why we maybe should have AA police. In my area, even though it's absolutely unfounded, I am known as something of a dictator-type sponsor. They indicate that I don't always share, but sometimes instruct. And but what people never realize is that in AA, to be a dictator, you must have the absolute approval of the dictatee. Because all he ever has to say is screw you and the dictatorship is over. I think it would be nice if we had AA police could come at night and say, "Did you say screw you to your sponsor?" Probably you could adopt it too for your fellowship. But they read these 12 traditions, and even then, Bill, I'm almost certain, I have no reason to think so, but I wasn't quite certain if they'd pass or not. He said, Having heard the traditions read and seeing no objections, we accept them. No vote there. And so they were accepted and gradually absorbed into Alcoholics Anonymous and changed our life. And the following year, Lois Wilson formally formed Al-Anon, which, of course, we say formed Al-Anon, it's like A was formed in 1935 or 38. And it was formed then, but it took a long time to dissipate, to see through the organization. Al-Anon little by little grew, and AA grew, and really not a great deal of things happened after that, that we don't know about, it's in our literature. But those early days, it just always sends a shiver down my spine, just those seconds and inches. If that woman hadn't been home when the minister called her, if Mrs. Smith had not answered the phone, if Lois hadn't thought to say, gee, you have. It's just on and on. There's all sorts of little things that you have to, and any one of them would undo us. If Ebby had gone to prison before Roland got there, we never would be here. Just so many things. If Bill Wilson had died on this last drunk instead of the drunk he was going to die on the next time, and on and on. And although it's musty history, it makes no difference, it's all fixed in cement now, but sometimes you might just think about that certainly I don't profess to know God's will, and I don't know if God meant for all these things to happen or if they're just blind coincidences, but whatever it was seconds and inches. And as a result of that, you and I are here today, and the biggest fight we have is to keep from taking it for granted. Okay, so what? So I'm sober. So I got an Al-Anon program. Because never in history has there been such a thing. You and I are lucky to be born in the only window, through no merit of our own, the only window in the human history of all mankind where such a thing exists. And we have to take care of it and cherish it. Thank you. Add one more thing I forgot. I've still got a minute. Shut up. I want to very much thank Fred and Mesa for coming to the airport and taking such good care of me yesterday. They did a good job, and I want to thank them. And I want to thank Maria for writing an excellent show. I was very impressed by it. We do a show in Los Angeles every year in our group, and we put in a token Al-Anon just begrudgingly. But now I'm going to play the role of the Al-Anon myself.
Okay, let's close this meeting with the Lord's Prayer. I do need to let you know that there is an AA speaker meeting at